Ever since the Cold War in the 1950s, the US has made a habit of arming terrorists and war criminals as long as they're willing to do our bidding. To people who may be ignorant on the details of US foreign policy, and I include the mainstream media and most elected politicians in that group, this may sound like an outlandish, absurd claim to make. But even a basic Google search of the US support of the Contras in Nicaragua, or the support of Pinochet in Chile, or the overthrow of the Ecuadorian government in the 50s, or the coup in El Salvador, or the multiple attempts to overthrow the Cuban government, or Ronald Reagan arming and funding the Mujahideen who later became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Any one of those examples prove my point, and again, those are just a few times out of dozens of cases where the US has done this. I know some people try to justify this and say it was all done in the name of freedom and democracy and all that jingoistic nonsense. I still think those are weak, flimsy arguments, and at the end of the day, all those actions were illegal under US law and international law. And in all those examples, we gave weapons and money to known terrorist groups and war criminals who used those very weapons to carry out genocides and crimes against humanity. Well, fast forward to 2019 and some of the players may have changed, but the game has not. Last week, CNN put out a report that found that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates on the ground in Yemen with US weapons. Now, this isn't a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to the genocide in Yemen since it began in 2015. Before the assault on Yemen began, Saudi Arabia was already one of the biggest financial backers of Al-Qaeda. This is really an open and shut case and not up for debate. Official investigations into the September 11th terrorist attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda found that 15 out of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, and a majority of the funding came from people in the Saudi royal family. So they financed the worst terrorist attack in US history and carried out by Al-Qaeda. They share a very similar extreme interpretation of the Islamic religion. In some of Hillary Clinton's emails that were leaked by WikiLeaks in 2016, there was a part of a transcript to a speech she gave to Wall Street executives after she was Secretary of State, where she acknowledged that the US has known for a while that Saudi Arabia builds and funds most Sunni mosques that practice Salafism and Wahhabism around the world, where they radicalize Muslims and encourage them to join jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The founders of the Taliban, which later branched off into Al-Qaeda, were part of the Saudi royal family. So Saudi Arabia's ties to jihadists are deep. And it's safe to say none of these groups I've mentioned would exist if they didn't have the support of Saudi Arabia. The fact that all of this information about Saudi Arabia's support of jihadist groups is public makes selling weapons to them entirely unconscionable, because you know for a fact they'll just hand them over to terrorists. If you're an honest actor whose goal is peace in Yemen or the Middle East, there is no way you would arm Saudi Arabia. So any type of peaceful, democratic solution in Yemen is clearly not the goal for the United States. In fact, another revelation that was in the article sheds light on what the true motives are here. Some of the US weapons have also ended up in the hands of Yemeni rebel groups who are on the opposite side of the conflict. Again, this is something that is very common in US foreign policy. This was just the case in Syria a few years ago. There was a report that showed that the Pentagon was arming certain rebel factions in Syria, and then the CIA was arming another set of rebel groups, and then they ended up fighting each other. It's strange credulity to think that every single time this happens, it's an accident. Because if that was the case, that would mean definitively that the people who are in charge of the US national security apparatus are the biggest bumbling fucking buffoons on the planet. I think that assessment of them is correct, but I don't think that's the only reason for this. The idea that weapons manufacturers and defense contractors in the military-industrial complex have an insane amount of influence over policy in the United States is not controversial. It's fairly obvious. The war and death industry donate to politicians almost more than any other industry. So in the corrupt political system that we currently exist in, where politicians routinely trade campaign donations for favors, it's easy to see the large amount of influence that defense contractors have over politicians and policy. Defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, they make a lot of money when there's war. In fact, if there wasn't war all over the world, they would be out of business. So once you have a hand in almost every major conflict in the world, ask yourself, how would you make even more profit? The answer is, you arm both sides. You keep the endless war machine turning because both sides have access to serious military-grade weapons. And instead of just making profit by selling weapons to one side of a conflict, you get to double up your profits by selling to both sides. Logically, the only people involved who stand to gain when the US arms both sides of a conflict are the weapons manufacturers and the defense contractors, as well as politicians who take their campaign donations. To people who aren't aware of the historical context of US foreign policy or the facts of the situation on the ground, or the catalyst for these conflicts, they look at that assessment of the situation and they call it conspiratorial in order to dismiss it out of hand. But it's only the most logical deduction you can make when you take into account all those factors. Am I saying that the profits of defense contractors are the only motivation behind this genocide? Of course not. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have their own financial, strategic, and ideological motives for doing this. But the bottom line is, the US almost certainly would not be involved if the defense contractors weren't making billions in dollars in profit off of this genocide. Before I go any further, I have to bring up the specifics of the devastation brought on Yemen by this brutal assault. 56,000 civilians have been killed since 2016, 28,000 killed in 2018 alone. This does not include a report that found that over 85,000 children have been starved to death due to the Saudi blockade of the country. 17 million other people are on the brink of starvation and famine. Over 1 million cases of cholera throughout the country, a preventable disease that is spread due to the lack of clean drinking water in the country. The country has been decimated by airstrikes targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Some notable and clearly illegal airstrikes were when the Saudis bombed a school bus and killed over 40 children. Or when they bombed an open-air market in the port city of Hodeidah and turned around and bombed the hospital where the injured were taken, killing over 60 people. Or when Doctors Without Borders just built a new cholera treatment center to address the epidemic caused by the genocide. The Saudi regime bombed the treatment center right before it was set to open. They bombed hospitals, they bombed schools, marketplaces, bridges, homes. It is because of this relentless assault waged by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States that the United Nations has declared Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, and it is entirely man-made. These are all things I've discussed on the show before. Now I want to get into what I consider the most important part of this video. We know that the US has technically been giving weapons to Saudi Arabia to hand over to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Those weapons have been used in the insane genocide and destruction of Yemen since 2015. Only recently has Congress shown any interest in ending this genocide. Notably, the House of Representatives just voted last night to invoke the War Powers Act to end US involvement in the genocide in Yemen. Don't get me wrong, I think that's a good thing. For years, the anti-war movement, including myself, has been relentlessly bringing up the issue of Yemen to get attention and hopefully get the US to end its involvement. So I think it's a great thing that it passed in the House. I also intend to upload a video on that fairly soon. But I'm seeing a lot of people popping champagne and celebrating as if that's it. Everyone can just pack up and go home. Yemen is all good. We stopped the US involvement in the genocide. Ending US involvement in Yemen is just the first step. There needs to be serious investigations carried out by Congress. There needs to be criminal investigations carried out by the Justice Department. Because we cannot abide by this anymore. We cannot keep starting these wars and selling weapons to terrorists and war criminals who use them to carry out unspeakable atrocities. And then whenever we feel like we've had enough blood on our hands and the defense contractors have made enough money, we just pack up and go home as if nothing ever happened. This is illegal any way you want to look at it. The war was unconstitutional. It was not approved by Congress. The sale of these weapons violated US law and international law. The war crimes that took place with those weapons in the aid of the United States were also massively illegal. Anyone who had a role in orchestrating the war or anything that followed thereafter needs to be investigated for war crimes and put in prison. Barack Obama's Secretary of State John Kerry and his deputies should be investigated for these crimes. The same for the Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. Same for Samantha Power at the UN, who provided cover for the entire operation. The generals and the admirals who provided direct support to the Saudi military and provided logistical aid. And yes, Barack Obama should be investigated for war crimes as well because he was at the head of all of this. And of course, anyone in the Trump administration who escalated this genocide after he came into office should be held just as accountable. Officials in the US cannot continue to flagrantly violate human rights and international law this way. It seems like if you're a US citizen, you're above reproach. It seems, no matter how heinous the war crimes you're responsible for, you cannot be labeled a war criminal and held responsible for your actions. Just look at what this backwards, twisted logic has led to. The US has illegally overthrown dozens of democratically elected governments around the world, at the behest of US corporations and the military-industrial complex. We've played a substantial role in countless genocides, arming and propping up authoritarian governments and terrorist groups and war criminals. Every time, all anybody has to say when they're caught red-handed is, oops, I meant well, and then everybody just lets them off the hook. George Bush illegally started the Iraq War, killed minimum 200,000 civilians. There's some estimates that over 1 million civilians died in the Iraq War. And just to let you know, the Iraq War is still going on 17 years later. His administration started a worldwide torture network where they were illegally kidnapping people, torturing them, and some of them they tortured to death. And they ended up being innocent. We broke the entire region, and out of the chaos came monstrous groups like ISIS and a resurgence of Al-Qaeda. Is George Bush, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, John fucking Bolton, are any of them sitting in a prison cell for the rest of their lives? No, you got fucking Dick Cheney every 2 years releasing a book saying why we should continue to torture people or why we should start another illegal military intervention somewhere else. You got George W. Bush fucking living it up. The establishment loves him. He's still a welcome member of polite society. He goes on Ellen's show and he fucking dances with her. You got Michelle Obama saying stupid shit like he's my partner in crime, giving all this fawning personal stories about her and her relationship with George W. Bush. Where are the consequences for John Bolton? Bolton right now is right back at the seat of power as a national security advisor to the President of the United States. He's a proven war criminal, one of the most egregious of the entire Bush administration. Was he shunned and shamed and investigated for his war crimes? No, he was rewarded by being named the head of the National Security Council. Of course, he's back to his old ways, pushing more U.S. military intervention. He damn sure supported the genocide in Yemen this entire time. But that's my point. These neocons, these war criminals who have infested the entire U.S. government seem to always find themselves back at the seat of power in Washington. They have no intention of going anywhere on their own. They like where they're at. Bolton's back in the White House calling all the shots in the area of national security. If you don't prosecute war criminals, you only embolden them to continue their actions and embolden others to do the same, if not worse. There needs to be public investigations and trials of these war criminals. We need to make it clear in the United States that we will no longer tolerate the flagrant violation of human rights from people who claim to be starting wars in the name of freedom and democracy. It needs to be made crystal clear that the next time a U.S. administration gets the idea to commit war crimes, there will be steep consequences. They need to know that their asses are going to be in prison for the next 50 years if they do it. That will make them think twice before ever doing some crazy shit like this again. Before anyone even gets the idea to follow the path of these neocons, they need to immediately see the image of John Bolton being publicly shamed at trial and sitting in a prison cell for the rest of his fucking life for the war crimes that he's committed. That's what needs to happen. And honestly, I haven't seen anybody, not even the best people on the issue of anti-interventionism and on Yemen, bring this up. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders. I'm talking about Ro Khanna. I'm talking about Tulsi Gabbard. You all did amazing work reinstating Congress's war powers control. No one can take that away from you. If this passes the Senate and gets signed by the president, and those are very big ifs, this will go down in history as the first time Congress has put an end to an illegal war. But before you go doing any victory laps, you need to pump the brakes a little bit. There needs to be serious talks about starting these investigations immediately. And like I mentioned, no one should be off limits. Because this is outrageous. It should never have happened. I guarantee if Obama thought for a second he could be charged for war crimes, if he authorized the U.S. involvement in Yemen, he would have never done it. But he thought he would get away with it. So we need to make very clear for future administrations that you will not get away with this. Your ass will be in prison for the rest of your life if you try to commit heinous war crimes and genocides and arming terrorist groups. Arming fucking Al-Qaeda, who attacked us on 9/11 and is the catalyst of all this war on terror bullshit going on around the world. So, slight credit to CNN for pointing out the obvious, even though in their article they made it seem like, oops, the U.S. accidentally gave weapons to Al-Qaeda again, like they always do. But at least they talked about it, at least they mentioned it. I damn sure haven't seen them mention it on air, but at least they wrote this article.